All right, we have the top 20 albums of June in 2024. And this was a tough one to put together. I think that there was both not quite enough to talk about, but also I just haven't really had time to work on the zine and get everything done. I've got a lot of other things going on that are not site related that I'm just busy with. I've got work and other things, and it's summertime and all that starting out. So they're not necessarily making excuses here, but it'll be a couple of delays for some things to really get out there over June and July, just for the sake of having time to get it done. I will say this was a good month and in terms of releases, and I found a lot of great stuff. But the stuff that was really good, it'll be really obvious. You'll probably have already guessed what my favorite record was. One change this month, other than delays, is that we're going to start with number 20 and then work our way down to number one. This has been long requested by many people. Rather than start with number one, we're going to start with number 20, and that's Fueled by Fear from Wraith. This is the latest album from this band, who are a pretty strong thrash metal band. This is a little bit more of a crossover thrash metal record in some ways. It still retains some of their blackened or almost death thrash sounding approach to neo thrash. And a lot of these songs are shorter. They're a lot more punkish, and they no longer really sound like Midnight, as I'd always felt they did on their first two or three records. Their third record had more or less previewed this style and shown us what they could do. And this one, what I would say, it extrapolates more from that style, and it splits it into like 14 songs and a pretty long record overall. And if you're a fan of like Toxic Holocaust and things like that, you'll get a good enough idea of what this is. But if you're also a fan of like Power Trip and Midnight, and you like all the popular thrash, adjacent things that are going on, I think this is a good record to sort of keep that zeitgeist going. Otherwise, I thought there were some good enough songs on here that have kind of a DRI or like mid-era Sodom kind of feeling to them, to where I could hang with this record, and I liked it overall.
Nobody safe on the clouds, louding their rules they will ride. Clouds at their side they stand guard.
At number 19, we have The Return of Tomorrow from Fu Manchu. This is a very well-known stoner rock band, and sometimes stoner metal, sometimes a little bit doom rock, and early on they were more of a punk band in some respects, influenced by early sludge and whatnot. But they've been their own thing for a very long time, and they've been independent for about 10 years or so, and this is part of this tangent they've been on, and they're doing their own thing, and they've been doing it really well. This is their best record since, I would say, probably since 1999. I've liked some of their stuff quite a bit, but this one resonated more with me as just classic Fu Manchu. It's got a little bit of that spirit. It's got kind of an upbeat attitude while they're singing about a doomed ass world. It's a pretty solid record, and then when it gets across, it's tuneful, and it's very well recorded, and it really suits them. I didn't feel like some of their records in the 2000s really suited them all that well, although they had a lot of fun with those too, I'm sure. But I feel like this really fits with kind of what I grew up with, which was 90s Fu Manchu and that style. And they play around with some more psychedelic jammed elements on the second disc here. So if you're up for a double album of stoner rock, I would definitely check this one out.
Telling me the same roads of the lonely, calling you by name. Roads of the lonely.
Halal Tangeli is one of two recent full-length albums from Sickle-Acidium, one experimental and one that is a little bit more canonical in the style that they've been developing for many years now. As a Romanian band, they obviously have a little bit of an Eastern European touch to what they do. There's an experimental or avant-garde side to it, but they're also influenced a little bit by grunge, the way like later Root was. They're not exactly singing along in like a grunge style, but there is a early kind of noise rock and post rock feeling to what they're doing, and I think that they kind of pull it off here. For me, I liked what the last record was doing, and this was like an extension of that. It's a little bit more bold with some of their choices of rhythms and the songcraft, whereas the lyrics are much more resigned to not do a lot and sort of be the voice from the megaphone. So an interesting record.
Like
is the latest full-length album from Feed Them Death, an Italy and UK based death grind band. And for this album, they've done something a bit different. They brought in a full three-piece for the group, and that's changed the dynamic. This had to be more of a realistic record because of that, and what I mean by realistic is that this is a simpler, more punkish thing that matches the early grindcore energy that the band always had, but it strips it back to something that is a little bit more chaotic, hardcore in motion, and I would say more like early noisecore and less like modern mathcore. And in a way, it's got that kind of. I guess my reference would be something like Dropped Out or Septic Death, and I think I referenced Born Against when I wrote about it. Basically, it's an interesting take on hardcore punk that also has that early grindcore feeling, and it doesn't really focus on blazing speed so much as weird noise. And I think that's really suits the style of the band. It's something that is a little bit unexpected from them, and they do it really well. And for as a fan of hardcore punk, more so the 80s and early 90s side of things, and I really like early grindcore as well. There's a lot that I like about the style of this record and also what it has to say. I think that's always been kind of the best part of Feed Them Death is the main guy behind it always has quite a lot to say. And so this really matched up with that. It's something I enjoyed quite a bit, and I haven't enjoyed a record in this style for a while. I've been focusing on kind of bigger, really ambitious metal records for a long time, and so this kind of brought me back to maybe just cutting into something that's a little bit easier to jump into, and it has a lot more adrenaline into it. And so, great record, and worth checking out. Affiliate Entity is a fairly new band out of the New York City area who play kind of a mixture of brutal death metal and the kind of the cosmic death metal you'll hear from bands like maybe the groovier side of Tomb Mold and the more recent stuff from Blood Incantation, and not so much that there's any sort of like Time Ghoul in here. This is maybe it is more brutal. It is a little bit more of a technical death metal band, and it's an interpretation of that sound that uses sci-fi and cosmic horror as a jumping point for what it has to say, but the music itself is more related to brutal death metal, and it has kind of chunkier, heavier grooves to all of it. And I like that they're able to space it out, but also keep it brutal, kind of like the maybe the second Afterbirth record or more recent Afterbirth in general. So check that out if that's your kind of thing. So The Healer is the latest album from Sumac, and I think they've really been on a be experimental as possible trip for a long time, and it's been hard to get into a lot of their records because some of them are just absolutely random dissonant noise, and not even intentionally noise. They just never really arrive upon a solid concrete point. And The Healer seems to have a vision for its sound design. It has points of cohesion and points of complete discombobulation of what I call the chicken without the head moment, where all the instruments just unravel in a way that is horrible. And I think that it worked so well for me when I listened to this record because of the way each song was both long form and they kind of come together. After sitting with more recent Old Man Gloom and going back in Sumac's discography, I don't think I wanted to write a review about this record, but rather just sit with it and appreciate the experimentation of it. And what ultimately comes of it is a good record from Sumac. Do I prefer their first two records? Yeah, I mean, like emphatically, yes. So those will probably get a much higher rating for me, but I could hang with this one. I enjoyed it quite a bit, and I think that it's worth mentioning this as one of the more remarkable records of the month because it really does stand out as something that is beyond kind of sludge metal. It's something I'm beyond like noise rock influenced things and experimental music. I think they've done something pretty interesting here, and it's worth sitting through at least once if you can handle it. This French melodic black metal band has only been around for a short period of time. Their intent is atmospheric, but their songwriting is distinctly melodic. And Scars of Yesteryears is a third full length in every sense, where this fellow, it really does seem like he knows what he's doing, and he's doing it really well. And the Dan Spano production values, the mastering of it, really helps keep everything feeling rushed, aggressive, moving at a clip that is reasonable for melodic black metal. And there's a lot of classic melodic black metal from obviously Sweden and other places on this record that give it authenticity, but also the license to play with much more accessible songwriting. And so that makes for an album that is memorable both for its references in terms of sound, but also memorable for its catchier songwriting in some respects. I think this is there's a lot of bands that reference melodic black metal. I think this is one that does it not only especially well, but it brings in the aggression that it needs to be interesting and last in most people's shelves. And so I feel like this is a special record in that sense, and I hope that he keeps it up in terms of just really hitting away at the drums as hard as possible and keeping that part of the sound, that aggression, alive in it, because it really livens up the what this type of music has to say and the way it's in the way that it's delivered. There was an interesting phenomenon when Crypt Sermon released their second full-length album back in, I think, 2019 or so, or maybe even 2018. It's been a while. It felt like everyone noticed a lot. It got a lot of notice for about a week. Everyone said it was their album of the year. They loved it. And then no one talked about it for 10 months or however long it was until the end of the year. And it didn't end up on a ton of lists. It didn't end up with a lot of mention. And that hype was so strong, it really felt like more people were just suddenly into epic doom metal, into epic heavy metal, and that this is one of the better bands doing it at the time. And so since then, we've had a lot of big records. We've had a lot of small records in this style, but it's good to see Crypt Sermon back with their distinct vocals, their very strong, well developed aesthetic, and their production values, which are obviously tuned a little bit cleaner this time around, less focused on the amount of reverb and all these other noisome elements of space, and they brought in clarity here to focus on the guitar work and the songwriting, and it's especially strong. This is a tight group of songs. They were obviously hand-picked and written to all work together, and it's pretty clear that this is a shot at 80s heavy metal done the way that they want to hear it, and it's fantastically done. So the reason it's not higher on this list is probably because not only were there more things that I listen to more often, but I did feel like there were only a few songs on here that really called to me beyond initial review, and there were only a few on here that seemed to last in my head as long as some of the ones from the previous records. Now, I will say this is their best record yet. I think that is a fair thing to say, and they seem to only get better with each one. So what I would say is I still have a lot of enthusiasm for this record. It just isn't pinging in mind at the moment as I put together this list.
Once through the mirror, the candles hush their light. A winged stag appears with tail of flame. Three binding corners, this ghastly...
Alienation Manifesto is a debut full-length album from black death metal band Thanatotherion. I think this is intended as more of maybe an almost 90s or symphonic black metal solo project at some point, but the fellow behind it brought in the drummer from Black Fucking Cancer, and it turned into a weirder, more technical sort of black metal thing, and it's a hard thing to describe because it's a bit different. It has this certain touch to it that is both obscure but also very much a USBM album. There's a thrash metal element to it. There's a lot that balances this thing out with both weird and exaggerative riffs and also very traditional touches here. But the big thing is that there's a use of keyboards and choral elements and things that are much more extravagant than expected, and all of it adds to this this sense of a very big, very grotesque event on this record, and it matches the nihilistic themes of the album pretty well. I had a great time listening to this and getting to know this record. There are a couple songs that are still, I think, very memorable and worth coming back to on it, and something that is different from the norm and something you won't see on every list, I suppose, for June this year. I've had a little bit of a back and forth with Fossil Gardens, the latest Hail Spirit Noir record. This Greek progressive black metal band began as more of the harsher psychedelic black metal sort of thing at a time when bands like Aranci Pazuzu were very popular. I wouldn't say they sound like that band, but they are kind of from that era and that zeitgeist, and it feels like people were reaching for the Ved Buen's End spectrum of black metal more often, at a time where bands like Code and a few others were popular for reaching into post black metal a little bit more often. And If you're a fan of something like Dot Heimskard or even Borknagar, you'll appreciate a lot of the things that Hail Spirit Noir are doing. But it feels like they've kind of achieved their own sound over the course of several records, and it's become more distinctly touched by progressive metal and progressive rock, especially from the 70s. And that carries through on this maybe heavier, more black metal oriented record compared to the last one, and it balances out some of the more pure progressive rock in a modern sense that it brings elsewhere. So very tuneful record, brilliantly written, and the recording is fantastic. I think this is just such a high standard. I didn't want to undersell it in my review. It isn't all the way to my own taste, but I do think this is an exceptional thing. Fans of British high fantasy author David Gemmell should recognize what Fellwarden are singing about on this latest full-length album, Legend. And while it does follow the events of a high fantasy novel, there's the sense that this is also an extension of the capabilities of Fellwarden and beyond a folkish version of atmospheric black metal into something that is a little bit heavy metal to it. There's a little bit more of a tuneful craft of it, and all of it is bigger, more blustering, and it makes for an epic record. So if epic, heavy, atmospheric black metal is a thing, I would say this is it, and not at all in the summoning realm. This is much more of a folkish, atmospheric type of thing. And anyway, it's a great record, just no matter how you describe it. And I think that it was undersold by a lot of people this month. I think it's a fantastic album, and I'm always impressed by what this guy comes up with, especially in Fen. And it was good to see this band going a little further with it, pushing a bit more at those borders and expanding their voice and their sound in general. Inconcessus Lux Lucis is a Manchester, England-based heavy metal band, and one that I would say is directly influenced by black metal as well. Temples Colliding into Fire is maybe their most traditional heavy metal record to date, but it's also maybe a first-wave black metal record in some sense as well. There are influences from 90s black thrash metal, of course, in their work, and there always has been, but this is maybe, again, they're one of their more traditional records overall, and it's interesting that they're on a very avant-garde label, but producing something that is inherently maybe more influenced by Motorhead and that kind of thing. So it works for me. It's a fantastic record. I love the album artwork. I love the sound of this record. I think they're fantastic songwriters, and I think everything that they put into this record is both spiritually apt and conveys quite a lot in what it has to say. The lyrics are fantastically written and convey their themes and what their spiritual aspect of it quite well. So there's a lot to admire here about this record. I've returned to it quite a bit over the course of time beyond the review process, and this still gets an enthusiastic nod from me. I think when you're tasked with talking about a band that you feel like put out one of the classics in brutal death metal, there's not usually a lot to say. This is a very well-known band, but also one that I don't know that a certain generation ever got in touch with. They've pretty intermittent release schedules. They're always a bit perfectionist with what they do, and they've always had a very distinct, brutal and aggressive sound. Malignancy are better known as a technical death metal band at this point, and I think that comes across here on this record, although they don't have a kind of a modern bone in their body in that sense, other than the way that a lot the drum interplay works in a specific way. This is a groove-oriented release and one that focuses on a specific type of riffcraft that is classic and really still effective in their hands in every way. If you're a fan of like Internal Bleeding, you should really know this band, and especially if you're a fan of like Mortician as well. They've got a lot of related aspects, even just in terms of membership with this band. And for me, their first record still has such a like an importance to me that I enjoyed coming back to their sound, looking through their discography, and finding this kind of it was the next step up that they haven't really taken for a while. It's been a long time since we got something from them, and I was enthusiastic about it as a longtime fan. Out in the Fields is the debut full-length album from Vendel. This is a Russian epic heavy metal band, one that has power metal influences to some extreme degree. And I would say this is in a way, this is so traditional and so standard and so straightforward that it's almost admirable how well they've stuck to their guns and even worked out some of the more extreme kind of skald-like features of doom in their sound and focused much more on the traditional heavy and power metal aspect of it. So very traditional heavy metal record, very classic sense of melody, lots of great solos. The vocals are not perfect, but overall this is a fantastic epic heavy metal record, and one that the most traditional of fans will enjoy just right from the start.
Freeborn behold, through this fake and cold, holding last breath alive.
Torn from the Jaws of Death is the latest Severe Torture record, and this is a Netherlands-based brutal death metal band who've incorporated technical elements over time, and they've got a little bit of progressive metal here and there in some of their song structures and the way they form some riffs. At the end of the day, this is still just a death metal band, and one that has evolved quite a bit beyond their first two records. I think that's kind of what this record does, and or maybe they've been intending to do for a long time, is to take their original sound and the way that it developed and marry the brutality and riff after riff sort of approach of it, and then work that into something that is still nowadays. It's still here in the now, and impressive in that sense too. So we never get a fully modern tech death gimmick here, but we do get a great death metal record, and one that is still in that Netherlands brutal death metal tradition that I remember from the late 90s and early 2000s. But otherwise, that doesn't mean that it's casting us fully back in time. This isn't a purely nostalgic record at all. It is a modern brutal death metal record otherwise. So figure that out for yourself. For me, it's just an instantly appreciable death metal record that attacks riff after riff throughout and never misses. Although I think it would be fair to describe Portrait as a band that sounds very much like kind of the Merciful Fate and King Diamond side of heavy metal. The Host is their first concept album, and it's one that it's essentially a tale of possession and macabre at that. And I think that they've done well to communicate what they're kind of pulling across in this very long, I think 74-minute record, and one that kind of shows you everything they've got in terms of the more Manila Road or Satan side of things. They've got a little bit more King Diamond than most bands in their sound, and all of it works for me. It's a fantastic record. I was a huge fan of their second and third records, and this feels like it's most related to those in terms of its rhythms that it develops, the vocalist and his oeuvre just showing all over the place. And I think that overall, The Host is one of their best records, and this is one of the few bands out there where I think the access they've given to this record helps sell it overall. They're much better when they're really getting into it and have enough time to really tell their story and convey a theme. So they've done a great job with it. Definitely one of the best records of the month. Harvest of Malevolence is the third full-length album from Hyperdontia. This is a death metal band out of both Turkey and Denmark, and overall it is maybe the more brutal side of the band, maybe the most direct side of the band, and it really follows an EP that set the stage for what this was. And that's a very straightforward form of ranting, aggressive, and somewhat brutal, a little bit technical death metal in a very classic sense. Now, I've loved their first record for its kind of frontalith style sound. I love their second record for how it tightened all that up and brought in some like Florida death metal in there too. And this one feels like it's got a little bit of Canadian and a little bit of New York death metal, tightening things up and focusing just on the riff. And I think the result of what they come up with always depends on the riff. And thankfully, this thing is pretty solid front to back. In some ways, I prefer the previous EP just a little bit more because it was just tight and succinct. But this record is also pretty tightly wound and fairly succinct in its runtime. So solid record, and one that I think is better than most things released in June. Violence Inherent in the System is the debut full-length album from Cleveland, Ohio-based death metal band Noxus. And I would say there's definitely a brutal touch to what they're doing here. There's definitely a modern sense of death metal in a lot of what they're doing, but there's also a technical and almost progressive side to their virtuosic playing and the variety of modes and gestures that they pack into this record. It's kind of a long record for a debut. It's kind of boldly so. They go a lot of different directions with it. These songs are very deep and involved. There's a lyrical theme that's very well thought through for each one. There's just a lot of effort put into this record for a debut. From a scene and from a band, I wouldn't have expected something that was this detailed and this full of ideas, because a lot of the younger generation of death metal that's happening right now is they just don't really care that much. A lot of it's ephemeral with what they're putting out, and this band, it feels like their statement matters and their work matters, and there's really an ethic that goes into this thing that just impresses me every time I put it on. So very excited about this record. I would love to see what they do next, and one of the better records of the month by far, definitely. In the Cesspit of Divine Decay is a pretty interesting prospect from Altar of Oblivion, because they bring in some of their oldest songs that they wrote way back and like before their first demo even came out, and then they bring in a new touch on all of it. This is the latest thing that they've done. They recorded a bunch of albums in a row. We're kind of seeing them one after another as they appear, and this is probably one of their best records to date. It's an epic heavy metal band from Denmark, and I wouldn't say that everything they've done is flawless, but they've improved with each release beyond the demo era, and they really found their sound over the last 3 or 4 releases. And I would say what to expect from this record is a blend of old and new. What you found back in 2019 with that record, and then what you found on their first record. I suppose I was surprised that this band pulled out such a big record when it sounded like they just kind of hit the studio and recorded a bunch of things, but they didn't necessarily warn us that it would be just one fantastic record after another. I put their last EP up on my best of the year list, and I think this record is worthy of making it up there too. It's a very fine record that fans of epic heavy metal and traditional heavy metal and epic doom metal will all appreciate for its songwriting, its performances, fantastic vocals. The production style is just perfectly suited for their sound, and it's all just very singular. It's their own thing, and I think it deserves a lot more praise.
Termination of the disbelief. My belief.
Ulcerates Cutting the Throat of God is my album of the month. I think that it is above and beyond most anything else released this month or this year. Otherwise, I think most of that relies more so on the songwriting of it, the unique guitar textures and techniques available to this band, and the way that the production values have enhanced the rhythm section and their statements all makes for a record that is both memorable, unique in its own right, and also just kind of a miserable sort of joy to listen to in terms of its performative value as well as its nihilistic statements overall. It's a very dark record. It's a very brutal record in that sense, but it's almost their most accessible statement. Yet it's a new font to dig into beyond the last, and it still feels related to the previous record, but takes on a whole different shade uh, otherwise. So really, it is the best of the month for me, and I think a lot of people would agree. But I could see myself swapping this with number two just as well, depending on my taste and the mood that I was in terms of what I wanted to listen to. So check that out. See if this is your thing if you haven't heard it yet. Give it some time to develop its sound, and go back to their previous record back from 2020. That was my album of the year. I'd say listen to that in addition and see which one might be for you. Otherwise, I would remind people to join the Patreon. You get a digital zine every month whenever I get around to it. You could buy merch at another site, and donating always helps me keep stuff going. I spend quite a lot of time on this site, and I appreciate people who always stop and help out. Thank you.